Welcome, everyone, to the September 2024 CLF Boston Northeast Regroup meeting. Today we have a presentation from Larry LaMotte of LaCapturit and Tina McCarthy of the Town of Brookline. We're going to look into some circularity, both regionally and kind of looking at process changes. After the presentation, we'll hold time for Q&A as we usually do, and then I'll probably around 1:50 look to take it back to give some updates on both the CLF Boston Northeast Hub and some of the changes looking to come to the reuse group. But I will say, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Larry and Tina to talk a bit about circularity regionally and some process changes. Larry.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Tina and I spoke yesterday, and actually she is going to lead us off and tell you a little bit about what work she's doing on and what we've done with Brookline first. So, Tina McCarthy.
Thanks, Larry. Hi, everyone. I'm Tina McCarthy. I'm a senior preservation planner with the Town of Brookline, Massachusetts. And I have been interested in deconstruction, and I did my master's thesis on it, and I've been working in this space for the 5 years that I've been in Brookline. So I don't know if I can share my screen, but I have just a few quick slides that might help us talk through this. I don't know if this group has really talked to a preservation planner yet about why we're interested specifically in reuse. I'm not sure what you guys are seeing. It doesn't seem, are you seeing my presentation slide now?
We are now. It's a bit big,
Okay.
but we are now.
I don't want to disappoint you, but I'm going to skip the case study and get right to the chase. So there's going to be a few slide flippers here. Hold on. This is for another conference that I'm going to. Sorry for the construction noise. Okay. So just to quickly orient you, my interest in this is kind of locating deconstruction within preservation practice. Preservation has the same problem as the rest of our culture. When it comes to waste, we disappear it. So there's a giant hole in preservation practice where deconstruction should be. We have preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and then the building is demolished and then reconstructed. And that whole demolition process is just missing. We have no treatments, we have no regulations for it. So I have gotten started with some policy analysis at the local level. I've been working in preservation, administering these bylaws for the last 5+ years. And I have the entire time been trying to facilitate salvage within our system. And I can tell you that it has not been effective. The current system doesn't really work. And so I'm not going to bore you with the details of our regulatory procedures at this point, but just to say that's what I've been working on. And these are some regulatory and planning strategies that we in Brookline have either undertaken. I would say by undertaken, I should limit that to myself. I am everything that's pretty much happening with deconstruction in Brookline, which is not a lot, to be honest, but I am trying to raise the awareness. And we have a new sustainability manager now, so I have high hopes for the future. But I have been working with my bylaws to try to rewrite and include deconstruction and salvage into our guidance documents. But there's other town regulations and planning solutions that we could go for should we get the political will to do so. So getting reports as a planner, that is one of the main ways that we build this political capital within town. So I commissioned this regional assessment for the Town of Brookline from ReCapturit. And I did this because I've been attending the Build Reuse conferences for years, and I also own a general contracting firm myself. And I know that any changes in regulations around deconstruction and salvage have profound impacts on the infrastructure of businesses and stakeholders that interact with buildings and their materials. So that's why I wanted to kind of focus the town and give them parameters within which to build policy. So the takeaway, you know, high level takeaway, this is it. It's complicated. This is from Larry's report. And I found one of the most insightful parts of the report for me was regarding the descriptions of regulation compliance levels. So Larry pointed out that our waste ban in Massachusetts exists, but maybe hasn't been entirely effective. Our ban on the disposal of clean gypsum wallboard resulted in a 4% recovery rate for the material. That's not awesome. And the reasons were really related to infrastructure, because people and the regulatory support to get to compliance and use of said infrastructure. People weren't source separating, and as a result, they were contaminating the material and it just wasn't being recovered. So the implementation of reuse really requires infrastructure. We have to invest in it and, importantly, pace our policy development to operate successfully within that available infrastructure. So with that, I'm really just going to hand it back to Larry and let him explain to you why these are his top 5 recommendations.
Thank you, Tina.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody, again. Now it's my turn to share the screen, and we'll go from there. So, looks like we're on. There. Okay. Oh, hello, Kathy Mercer. Nice to see you. Welcome. As you see on the screen here, I've just completed an ebook, and it's available to everybody that's here today. If they want a copy, just send me an email at the address you see here, and I'll send that to you. And it's going to describe in much greater detail what I'm going to go over today. So I'm going to start with a quick quotation from Michael Orbank in a recent post of his. He said, "First step deconstruction efforts not only can be enacted at cost parity, but can save money and embody carbon. Innovate, figure out what is possible, be part of the solution so that these monumental policy movement failures can be a thing of the past." Oh, and please get loud. I like that. Thanks, Michael. Forgive me, I'm going to break most of the PowerPoint rules. I just wanted to throw that in there. But let's carry on. We are creating together at ReCapturit a constellation of stellar solutions to the huge problem of C&D waste as a North Star guide for us all. And as Tina briefly explained to you all, her background, my background, I started in architecture. I went into remodel carpentry. I then into design build. I built our own house. I've been squirreling away materials, in my world for decades. I didn't even know it was that big of a problem. I went into facilities management and took care of other people's buildings and other people's projects and so forth. And so I wrapped it all up in a company called ReCapturit several years ago. And that's where we are today. So first, I want to tell you a little story. It's kind of a cautionary tale to keep in mind as we talk about policy and incentives and things that we're going to do. The holidays are coming up. And if you are if you have had the opportunity to sit at a Thanksgiving table that has been bountiful, you know what it feels like to have ample food, to have the supply of food coming your way in large quantities to the point where you are satiated and you want to push away from the dining room table and go, "I'm done, I'm full." And there are people that are going to go off and take a little nap. There are people that are going to go off and watch football. There are people that are going to go clean up the kitchen. Well, what if, and I say what if, this is a big what if, but what if the food you ate and you're stuffed with, and there's one person getting that last little sliver of pie? Well, what if the supply continued and it kept coming and it kept coming? Because somebody said, well, we're going to put more supply into the system. This is the system, the dining room table, and you're going to have more supply and more supply and more supply. Wait a minute, wait. We're full. We're full. Okay, so what happens? Gluts, backlogs, log jams of stuff, right? Well, where does it go then? It goes to waste. If it keeps coming, where does it go? It goes to more waste. And some of you are probably guessing now that I'm doing this as a comparison for the situation of the waste of construction and demolition and that which goes into actually building materials and the channels of distribution of that, which barely makes it to 15% of the total that would be waste, the 85% going to the dump. Okay, so that's where it would go. That's what it would feel like if we saw it, but we don't see it. So what's the moral of the story? This is what happens when supply exceeds demand. More on that later. Now let's look at the context for all this and the why and the where we are and the what inspired Michael to think that it would be beneficial for me to communicate this to you. So I've spent the last 7 years working on ReCapturit from the earliest stages of investigation to the development, the launch, and now where we are, where we're not only doing the marketplace, but we're doing consulting and other things. But I had to look at the old model of distribution, the current model of distribution. How do these materials of deconstructed buildings, where do they go? Well, and where do they come from? So in the current model, they come from mostly houses and some skimming and some pickers and a variety of sources, but mostly from residential sources. They get transported and they find their way into an in-city retail salvage store. We just generically call them salvage stores. It's like Habitat for Humanity and others that you all probably know well. We have found 2,000 of them across the country, and we have what we think is probably the most complete list of those. And some of them are just mom and pop squirreled away in a corner, and some of them are, big 120,000 square foot places in, like Pittsburgh and other big cities. But how do they move out of there? Well, a little bit goes through online sales. And I say a little bit because it's a tiny, tiny fraction. It's like 2% tops, because even though a lot of salvage sellers do put their materials online, they just display them. They don't actually do the transaction online because that requires weighing the materials, measuring the materials, and putting that into a system so that shipping can be calculated. So they don't do that. So a lot of it, 98% or more, actually goes out in Subarus and pickup trucks and so forth. And where do they end up? They end up in houses. In ReCapturit, in our marketplace, we have chased down so many little things of specific flooring matches, and we need 3 doorknobs for a remodel that we're doing for an 1896 Victorian. Okay, we did that. But most of it ends up in residential projects and in what a friend of mine in the reuse industry is called cameo projects, meaning it's not the whole building, but it's an aesthetic portion of the building. You'll see it in restaurants. You'll see it in bars. You'll see it in hotel lobbies. Like, oh, this beautiful mahogany background here, that came out of an 1890, 90 church or whatever. And I say, that's gorgeous. It's beautiful. What about the 430 rooms? Crickets, right? And then the sad fact is that a lot of the materials that go from being deconstructed, transported, processed, and attempted to be sold actually still end up in the landfill. So that's the current model of distribution of recaptured building materials in America today. My architectural drafting teacher in junior high school, a man named Keith Van Winkle, was friends with our Buckminster Fuller. Bucky Fuller, he called him, Bucky. So Bucky said, you probably all have heard this before, but I'm going to say it anyway, you can never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Okay, so we just looked at the existing model. Let's look at the new model. First, this is a reminder I always throw in, because when we start talking about this, who are people that aren't as imbued in this sort of thing as you all are and I am, they kind of latch in on one thing, and they often go to construction. They say, oh yeah, I've seen that, particularly the people that have worked in construction. They say, oh yeah, there's tons of waste. I mean, it just comes out of they're just throwing away new stuff. Yes, they are. But these are EPA numbers, really. You know, construction is really only about 10% of that. And demolition is about 90% of that. And deconstruction is even less than 1%. So you all know that. But I like to remind those that I'm talking with that, you know, there's more sources, and because we're going to bring them all in the new model. Here's one that's often overlooked: surplus, overages, discounts, or discontinued, seconds, returns. Those, some think of those. There's a Habitat for Humanity about 30 miles from Boston that I spoke with. They get things from Lowe's and big, you know, warehouse, new distributors of materials. They get stuff from them all the time. I thought, well, that's brilliant. That's surplus. It's their overages, it's their discontinueds, it's their seconds and returns. Urban mining, now that's a bigger, broader term for proactive removal of materials for value, and we use it specifically for building materials. But that's another way to go after them, is to go and target buildings for deconstruction to get at the materials for their value. Okay, then that all fits into the new model of distribution of recaptured building materials. So starting at the bottom, of course, like why wouldn't you start at the top? Because that's the way my note-taking goes in my journal. So where will the materials come from? Well, they're still going to come from residential. They're also going to come from dismantling retail and other buildings of that size, and institutional buildings, like the one in Boulder, Colorado, which was a 260,000 square foot hospital that came down within the last few years. So those are all the sources now, not just residential, not just the tiny soft skimming, but we're going to go after bigger portions, because now we're going to have a way to process this. We're going to get to that in a minute. And remember, demolition, deconstruction, construction, surplus, and urban mining. It gets transported. This in the middle, wholesale processing, that's different. That's part of the new model. It's not part of the old model. This is not a retail outfit. This is a large warehouse in the woods. You know, by woods, I mean out in the Tules, where real estate is not as expensive. It gets processed in there. And now where's it going to go? How do we make these things available to new, bigger buyers and projects? Well, it's going to go ultimately up to architects, engineers, construction, and developers. That is currently not a thing in the existing model, but it is in the new model. And we're also going to be able to provide wholesale to in-city retail, because now it's going to be all cleaned up, processed, and ready to go. So we can act as wholesalers to in-city retailers. And then down at the bottom of that section, you see a little oddball looking train. But the point is that shipping becomes much more efficient at scale when you can put it onto a train car or into a full semi-load. And then ultimately, where's it going to end up? It's going to end up in houses. It's going to end up in apartment buildings. It's going to end up in institutional, in ways that are not currently available, because we're going after that 85%, not the 15% that's already being done. Okay, here's where the story of too much supply, the Thanksgiving analogy, too much supply without ample demand becomes a problem. We're going to be talking about putting policy in place. So here's a way that it has happened in places across America, and I'm putting in a little warning. You put a policy in place to divert materials from the dump, but you make no provision for demand for these materials and say they'll just have to figure it out. Those words hurt my heart. Oh, they will figure it out all right. But we're dealing here with people's lives and livelihoods, businesses, individuals, organizations that have to adapt. So let's help them do that. Because 1,000 solutions, some legal, some not, is not a solution. But if we just let them figure it out, that's what happens. So let's do it right first. So a little review. We're going to leave the old model of distribution pretty much as is. That's fine. It's operating. It's there. They're doing great work. They're working very hard, and it does a service, but it's still got about 5 or 6 times the materials that it can't process. So remember to go to all 5 sources, and then work with the new model of distribution of recaptured building materials. So like I said, we're putting together a constellation of stellar solutions to the huge problem of C&D waste. So what does that really mean? What are we doing? Well, there are channels of distribution, meaning marketing and sales mechanisms. Well, ReCapturit's marketplace has been that. We sell stuff. We sell building materials. We're built specifically for used building materials. Nothing else. You can't even put things on there. If you got a car, sorry, doesn't go on there. We have a model on the drawing board now for our next version of it, which will be more focused on the B2C, that of moving to the architecture, engineering, and construction world, as opposed to the residential world. But our existing marketplace is even built for the AEC community. But we found now, like many startups do, that we have things that we didn't do that we should have done, and things that we did do that just didn't get used as much as we thought they were going to be, or they promised would do. But that's the way things go. So here we are. So we got that. It's a channel of distribution, the ReCapturit marketplace. Here's one thing we found out we missed. We call it the wheelhouse. And you're going to go, well, what's that? Well, the wheelhouse. Yeah, right. What's that? The wheelhouse will be a universal inventory system for the entire building materials reuse community. Think of it like putting an inventory into a suitcase that you can carry with you and plug it into anywhere. Okay, what does that do for anyone? This is one place, one easy place to input materials into inventory and then plug it in to anywhere you need it. So of course, up in the top, I put ReCapturit, but there's also eBay, there's Cherish, there's Etsy, there are other marketplaces, exchanges, and directories into which this can go. There are also places you can pull from or put into, like a Shopify site, if you have a Shopify site, or from CSV files, you know, an Excel spreadsheet, essentially. Remember this, the in-city model, the in-city retail model, most sellers have no modern inventory system. They typically use what I call the masking tape and Sharpie inventory system, which is no diss on them. It's just the way it works. Masking tape and Sharpie, you put a little sticker on it and you put it out into the geographical layout of the store, and that's their inventory system. And it's worked. Okay, but that doesn't scale. So we are creating one place to input any materials inventory and then plug it in anywhere you need it. Here's where it's headed. This is the big end goal, and you'll get this. And this is something Michael and I talked about. It's headed to the AEC community. They can't get this stuff now, but they are the sleeping dragon of demand. They want it, they would use it, but it's got to be played in their formats. It's got to be in their technology. It's got to be available in their channels of specifying, purchasing, and paying for, that happens in the sequence of architects and engineers to builders to developers and building owners. That doesn't happen now, but it will in our world. So yeah, so it's headed to the AEC community. How do you get materials into this? And note here that over here, it's going into AutoCAD and Revit. It can they can use it for 3D modeling. It will have the master format category system. How do you get these materials into the system? Inputs, handheld devices, laptops, computers, phones, tablets. What will go in? Photos, characteristics like weight and dimensions, and a big one, specifications. And you can create digital twins, a digital three-dimensional model that can be manipulated in the technology of architects and engineers. And then what I think is actually the biggest one of all, everything gets a barcode. Everything gets a unique identifier, and that's going to serve everybody in lots of amazing ways, but everything gets a barcode. Here's some interesting advantages downstream of this. Who else can benefit from this innovation? Real estate and developers and building owners, they seem to be the big obstacle, but they're not necessarily the hindrance we think them to be. They just think sustainability of their companies before they think of sustainability on a broader scale. They have to have a bottom line. So here's another way to look at it. They own the buildings, so they own the materials until they do not. Here's another one. We all think about this all the time. Some of you may be part of the local government, Massachusetts government, whatever. But governments, they want to track things. Well, by having unity of the system, Rather than 1,000 different systems, it's a whole lot easier to get information and data with which you can track things and with which you can attach things like life cycle analysis, LCAs, and like EPDs, environmental product declarations. You can put LCAs and EPDs and things like, what do we call them, materials passports on anything now because it has a unique identifier. Okay, what's next? So if you look at this, we have now a channel of distribution, the marketplace. We're talking about technology. What's next? Well, as Tina described, we're doing consulting now for cities, towns, counties, regions across America. It's basically an educational aspect. We're guiding, we're helping them by virtue of what we have come to learn over the years of doing all this that we've done. We're helping cities, towns, counties across America to embrace incentives and policies and other things that can inspire diversion, deconstruction, reuse, and ultimately the use of the new materials or the used materials. Whoops, wrong way. Here's a big component. This is our design for that regional processing and distribution. We call it the Transformation Distribution Center because it does that. It transforms and distributes. Of course, you can't see it because it's so small. So we're going to get it a little bigger, and then we're going to go through it real quickly. Left to right, it's just simply the process chain. I basically call it job site to job site. That's the full circularity. You're going from the job site where you take it out to ship it out to the job site where it's going to go into a new construction. Over on the left of the screen now, you see two things that you might have noticed in the previous slide a couple of slides ago. Smart dumpsters and smart pallet jacks. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail how these work and what they do, but imagine if you could actually weigh on the job site the materials that you will be diverting easily so that you can convert that weight now to what it will cost ultimately at the landfill or at the transfer station for the tipping fees that they will charge. What do? You drive up the truck, you drive it onto the scale, they tell you it's going to be $1,000, it's going to be $50, it's going to be $100, whatever it is, but they tell you because they have the weight. Well, if you don't have the weight back at the job site, well, how do you do that? Well, you do that with a smart dumpster or with a smart pallet jack. Okay. Where do these things go? We like to go back to this one. We like to make things simple. I have an acronym called PACES. PASES stands for profit, affected stakeholder empathy, and simplicity. I use that just because I need to be reminded. Think about profit, protect it, because that's what's holding up the developers and the building owners, right? Also the construction companies that have to have, that would be required by policy to behave in certain ways. That's another way. So respect profit. ASE, affected stakeholder empathy. Think about the people that are being affected. The job site supervisor, who's basically a carpenter or a tradesperson, and now he or she is saddled with having to fill out reports at the end of the day and take photos and measure things and distribute them in different ways. And that's a tough switch for a job like that. So just a reminder, just a thing to think about. Keep it simple. So where do those things go? Well, up in the red pill version, it's going to the dump. It's going to the end of life. Down in the blue pill version, it's going to the Transformation Distribution Center. And I'll reiterate here, it's wholesale only. There is no walk-in retail. It is out in a lesser valued property, so it costs less, there's lesser overhead, and it's near to a highway and hopefully to a rail line for faster, more efficient distribution. What happens inside? It gets inspected and sorted. There are even robotic sorters that some of you are probably well aware of that are in MRFs, materials recycling facilities now. So there's that. Inside it also gets processed. It gets labeled, it gets bundled, it gets weighed, it gets palleted, it gets photographed, and it gets inputted into an inventory database with its unique identifier, its barcode. And then it's ready for packing and made ready for shipment. And then it gets shipped out efficiently. It's at scale. multiples of what the current system can process. This system can process multiples of it because it can do it at scale. It can do it with efficiencies that are not available in the in-store retail model. Okay, so now we've had channels of distribution, we have technology, we have education through our consulting, we have the transformation distribution centers, which are really the warehouse processing facility. I made a few notes in here for somebody else, so we're going to skip over that. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is what we call the brick. What's the brick? Again, too small to see, but the brick. It stands for building resources for inspiration, community, and knowledge. BRICK. So the I, the inspiration. We all need help getting away from that staring at a blank page mentality. What would I do with used bricks? Well, if you need a little help in the inspiration category for used bricks and where they would go and what you would do with them, and you are given 6, 7, 8, 12 different photographs of installations of used bricks in new modern buildings, then you have a little inspiration. You go, oh, that's cool. Oh, I would like that. Oh, they panelize them. Oh, that's smart. Things like that. So that's the inspiration. Community, that's pretty much what it is. We're not very far along on that one, but the knowledge base, this is very important to the whole reuse industry, and it's part of the whole ecosystem that can help adoption and acceleration, is the knowledge portion, the shared knowledge portion. Now, build reuse. All for Reuse and other organizations do a good job of some of that information already. What we're working on now is a more interactive, AI-enabled, I said it, AI-enabled resource library that has in that library only the things that we put there. So they get peer reviewed, they're vetted, and they're information that's relevant, that's new, or that's current, up to date, and valid. And then our, what we call the robot librarian, will be your guide through that, through both a graphical interface that takes you through, lumber, heavy timbers, or things like CLT, cross-laminated timbers and things like that in a graphical interface. So you can go that way if you don't know how to write a prompt. If you do know how to write a prompt, you go over to it and like Chat GPT and you write a prompt and you say, here's what I'm looking for, and it spits out an answer for you, and it helps you with your research with valid information from good sources. That's where we're going with that. So that's pretty much it. We're partnering with a bunch of organizations. Part of the work that I did before setting up our consultancy arm of ReCapturit was to go out to people and companies and organizations that I know and said, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to help cities and towns adopt policy. We're going to help them to put in incentives. We're going to help them to just do the groundwork for what's necessary to bring in more diversion, deconstruction, reuse, and ultimately use of the used materials. And would you be willing to be part of that, in the sense that when we need somebody that does what you do, would you be willing to do it? And people said, yes. So that includes people like the Green Mission, which does pre-salvage assessments and tax benefit advantages. Adaptus AI is a magnificent new technology company up in Toronto with great BIM, building information modeling technology that works also for the used building materials world too. Urban Machine, you probably all know about that one. It's out in Oakland, California, started up by Eric Law, and it is a robotic, nail-pulling, screw-extracting, bolt-tugging machine that cleans, processes, and spits out clean lumber at a job site at the rate of a semi full of new lumber from old lumber on a day-to-day basis. We're going to have, and Eric and I have talked about this many times, we'll have an urban machine in all of the transformation distribution centers that we can put them in. So anyway, let's talk about how we can collaborate, and I'll stop talking. So obviously collaboration, doing things like we're doing today. Projects, we're available for projects like we just did with Brookline. Referrals, we do referrals all the time. We send people to other people all the time because we need to talk about the cool things that are going on across the country and across the world, because other people just don't know about those things. And when we do, people go like, oh, wow. Sponsorships, you know, we're a startup. We've needed sponsorships. You know, I'm not embarrassed about that. You know, we all need money. Now, if you're in an organization that pays you all the time, without that, great. Grants. We have been blessed with recently being put on a grant proposal by the Boston Architectural College. And so we're on that with them. So that's a good thing. What's next for Boston? And this goes back to what Tina said were my top 5. I expanded it out to a few more. And thank you for bringing those to our attention earlier. Tina, here's the list. And I highlighted the first one because finding a champion of the cause, a leader, because as you all have experienced, as have I, and we just participated in this, we did a report. You know, it's 38 pages or whatever. It's a lot of stuff. You guys have done reports. I read the CLF Boston report, the very graphically interesting, very smart thing that Michael and company put together. I told so many people that is the smartest, most comprehensive understanding of the ecosystem of reuse that I have ever seen to date. And I've been at this for a while. So kudos to you for doing that. But with that, we have studies and reports upon committees and studies and reports. There's got to be some action. Somebody's got to take the baton and run with it, a leader. So I put that first. Sometimes we don't want to talk about that. People get uncomfortable, like looking like, don't look at me. I don't want to raise my hand. That's okay. Maybe you can help find the leader because you can't do it. Maybe you can help find that. So think about that. Anyway, I won't dwell on that anymore, but that's number 1 on the list of priority because that has to happen. That's Stephanie Phillips in San Antonio. That's Sean Wood in Portland, Oregon. That's Emily Freeman in Boulder, Colorado. Those are the champions. Okay, establish demand, connections, buyers. I talked about this. You gotta talk to the buyers. That's the end of the supply chain. You gotta talk to them. Without that connection, warehouses fill up and you've got that Thanksgiving table scenario where supply just keeps coming in, but it doesn't have a place to go because you got to find a hungry audience. Okay, engage early with stakeholders, anticipate and develop large-scale storage like we do with our TDC, train the workforce for deconstruction. Stephanie Phillips said that was one of the smartest things they did in advance. Research and become familiar with technology. I've mentioned a few things there, but there's so many more, and I'd love to share them with you. Familiarize with materials marketing channels. That means where do they get sold? Where do they get distributed and moved, like ReCapturit and other things. Consider policy and incentive options. And that I put at the last, because let's do some homework. Let's do some legwork before we start going after the application of a policy without adequate understanding of where we are currently and where we need to go. And that's where I hope I've inspired you with a North Star of where we might go. So that's it. Thank you. We're here to help. Remember, send me an email. That's my email address. I'll make sure you get a copy of the book, Total Reuse, the new model for distribution of recaptured building materials. And it'll be out soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. We can open it up now for some Q&A. As I said in the chat, if you have any questions, feel free to use the raise hand function or type them in. I will start out with one question, though, and to both Tina and Larry. From the assessment review for the town of Brookline, is there any first steps that were either glaringly obvious or really could, given the state of the regional market, make sense for Brookline to step forward towards in the near future?
Tina, do you want to handle that one?
Well, I found it really interesting that after Find a Champion, Larry's second recommendation was to establish demand, because I see preservation as being in a really good position to start to establish some like demand within like people's understanding of how reuse can be awesome, because we are cultural planners, like that's what we do. So I got excited about a lot of the programs that our office has been considering, like doing reuse, like workshops or like community events where people could, for example, come learn how to restore windows with Brookline's experienced window restoration planners, which we happen to have 2 in our office. So things like that, that, yeah, that were exciting to me personally. I don't know if that answers your question.
A bit, and then I think I'll just put Larry in your priorities for growing the market. Say you're either brought in to consult on a market who's maybe just there, who has a lot of the pieces but hasn't really put it together. I know you had given your priorities, but is there anything that you think is pretty fundamental in a first step for really getting over the hump? You had said policy being kind of on the last of the priority. So I'm curious, in a market that the AC community is really looking for, and I guess I could use Boston as an example, what would you say is really the most important for the industry to really step towards?
Well, thanks. We did for Brookline what I would suggest, and in fact, we insist upon doing it before we go any further, which is that current state assessment of where things are in the deconstruction, in the recycling, in the reuse, in demolition, and are there policies, are there organizations, are there things in place that we can already take advantage of, or that we know to be an obstacle that we can deal with and talk to, that sort of a thing. So that's why we're very adamant about doing an assessment of what is the current state of affairs in the region first. Because only with that understanding, I mean, to put it in architectural terms, it's the foundation. It's the foundation upon which we are building. And I have witnessed, I talk to hundreds and hundreds of people all over the country and all over the world now. And I have found the unfortunate glaring gaps in knowledge that could have been filled had they done the work of doing an assessment of what they already have active in the area. Because when we talked to people, we phoned dozens and dozens of people and actually only got to talk to less than a dozen, but that happens in and around the Boston and Brookline area. We had people there that like, I would just love to be a part of this. I would put my time and energy into it. And it's like, why aren't you? What's holding that back? Well, that just shows a tiny little glimpse into what is not happening, is that knowledge of who's out there, who's doing things now, and how can we collaborate and bring them together in a collective energy and point all the vectors of activity in the same direction. So that's where I suggest starting. So, and then more directly to the AEC community, as you asked, Michael. Having worked in architecture, having worked in construction, I reference that all the time because they do things in a certain way, and they have processes in place, and they have demands, very strong demands put on them, financial, temporal demands put on them. So how can we get into the flow? So what I've done and what you could do is to actually talk to them and start conversations out with things like, well, what if used materials were made available to you in the same flow as you now access and source new materials? Would that make a difference? Would you think used materials first? Would you consider that for the option that you now have, and see where that goes? Those kinds of conversations have been extraordinarily illuminating, because you'll find that some don't really give a rip. Okay, that's the world, that's humanity. Some are intensely aware of it, and they have been held in check their entire career because of the other pressures upon them. But then you just opened a thing. Now there's a gentleman at in Brookline. I'm struggling to remember his name. Sept. Don't remember his last name, but he owns a salvage store that sells primarily hardware. He said to me, He said, Larry, I'm one of the most cynical people I know. I'm one of the most skeptical. He says, I've been in this business of deconstruction and reuse and everything for 30 years. In the last 25 years, I have not had any hope for the future because I just keep running into what we all are running into, which is sort of, the equivalent of a glass ceiling or a wall or an obstruction. He says, but you just cracked my shell. You just put some light inside this shell that I've had for 25 years because you're talking about where it can go. So that is awesome. I mean, I'm glad he felt that way, but that came from these conversations with architects, the people that specify on behalf of the builders ordering, paying for them, buying them, because understanding that mechanism, that architects can't purchase it, but they can specify it. So how do we facilitate that? And that's more of what you talk to them about. What if we included specifications, dimensions, and had things in BIM systems so that you could put that into Revit and you could model a used material, used doors, 40 used doors for your new building, because you have all that. And you now have a digital twin of those doors that you can play around in Revit with right alongside new doors. Would you do that? Those are the kinds of questions that I am asking the architecture engineering community now. I've spoken many times with the engineer who did the work at, whose firm did the work in Boulder, Colorado, of disassembling that 260,000 square foot hospital and extracting out of it the steel members and then stress testing them on site to make them available as though they were new, because they now met the specifications. Okay, so what Greg Kingsley, that's his name, who owns the firm, KLA out in Boulder, did is novel in the US. It's being done in Europe, but it's novel in the US. But throw that into the mix of the conversation with the architects and engineers. You know that steel is being extracted from buildings now in prime condition, ready for reuse and stress tested on site so that you can have trust, because engineers are even more, what's the word? What's a nice word?
Risk adverse.
Yeah, risk averse. Thank you. I was thinking finicky, but risk averse. Good call. So anyway, you're a civil engineer, Michael. So yeah, you would say that. Anyway, does that help?
Yeah, no, I think you're hitting a lot of things that have been touched before in this group, and I think in a lot of guides that have come out with the fact that radical collaboration is really needed, and a lot of these new forms you had mentioned, kind of pulling out steel about a month ago at Northeastern University, the SEI.
Nice.
Structural Engineer Institute held together looking at embodied carbon, and a huge thing that was pulled out of that is, if we have all of this steel, if we have all these materials, we need to do better. We need to talk and make these connections we weren't doing before to really break through this, because there's all these materials that could be, there's all these opportunities that just aren't being explored. There are these connections that aren't being made. So I think you're really hitting on the head with a lot of that. I will go to Cam though for a quick question, and then after close out. Cam.
Hey, thanks so much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. Thought I'd get my camera on. There we go. I'm with the Consigli Sustainability Department. A question for either of you, really. I think that one of the roadblocks in scaling the sort of industry that you're talking about is, like you mentioned, maybe quality concerns about the materials that are coming out of these facilities or warehouses that you hypothesized we would create one day. I think that when it comes to sustainability, we're finally reaching the cusp of where it would not necessarily benefit the life cycle of the building to put in recycled material. It would be, because for whatever reason, it could have a quality problem. It's just versus a virgin material, people are skeptical about using a recycled material. So I'm curious to know how you envision bridging that gap between virgin materials and reused materials. Like you said, do we stress test the materials? Do we partner with manufacturers to perform quality inspections on the materials that are coming out of these warehouses so that they could serve as an equivalent replacement and come at a discounted cost. I mean, that's one way that I actually see that coming into fruition in the market. And I'll let either one of you, if you have an answer for it.
So Tina, do you have one? I do, if you don't.
Please go ahead.
Okay. All right. So Cam, very good question. Thanks. And we think about this a lot, and because that is a commonly perceived hurdle. And as I said about the steel members coming out of that hospital in Boulder, that they did the stress testing immediately, and they painted it on the side of it so that it they had an engineer's stamp certifying that grade of that steel member was what it was supposed to be. So there's that kind of a thing. Now, in talking with Urban Machine, the company I mentioned out in Oakland, California, with that robotic nail and screw extracting machine that makes new lumber out of old, one of the things that I brought to Eric's attention a couple of years ago was that there are automated graders of lumber that are being developed now. There's a company in Corvallis, Oregon, that is at Lucidine Technologies that does automated grading of lumber for new lumber. But that technology is now being translated for used lumber and to be used on a remote availability, more like the Urban Machine is on a truck bed that can go job site to job site. So Eric's working with about 3 or 4 of those companies around the world to get that automated grading done of the materials as they come out of the machine. So it's instantaneous. But what they do now is they grade it on site with human beings. When they go to a big job site to pull out truckloads of lumber, and that may be all a bunch of glue-lam beams. I mean, they've done things, stadium size. So they're getting giant glue-lam beams, but they need to be inspected. So they get the inspectors of the lumber right on site, and they do it now with humans now, but the technology is actually becoming available. So that's just a whisper away. So that's wood and that's steel. And then how do we get over the other thrift store attitude of other types of materials and so forth? Well, bricks and masonry, well, you don't really have to do much with that to figure that one out. But it really is the steel structure and the wood structure, because structural members have to be what they say they are. And so that couples in with code revisions, like happened in Washington State and in Oregon. And that was that they revised the building code to allow for used lumber, which what all they did was say that every piece of used lumber is going to get, even if it's prime select structural Doug fir, it's still going to be just like spruce pine fir #2. Okay, so it's just downgraded, but it's still usable, right? So there's that. And then some of the other hurdles, the cleaning and processing and things that we've suggested, and putting them into systems and putting them into use in situations that can be tested. That's another thing. It's got to get over some cultural, societal hurdles. And that'll happen over time, like any new adoption of things. People never thought they would ever be sleeping on somebody else's bed in their own house, but Airbnb transformed that. Uber transformed the auto, rental, or the taxi world, to where you're driving around in somebody else's car. It happens. It takes time, but it's going to take those that initiate out on the front lines to make it happen first. And then lastly, well, actually, that's probably enough on that, if that helps to answer your question, Cam.
Yeah, that was great. I can't wait to read the book. Thank you for answering my question.
Thanks.
And lastly, we'll go to Christian for the last question.
Yeah, so I had like a bit of like a question/concern. And this comes from having also been really interested in this type of space, interested in the way that we could use information to de-risk used materials. But even like we're talking about like stress testing structural steel, or improving these information systems, or deconstruction, all of this is like at the end of the day still very supply side focused on the marketplace. And I worry that we have an assumption that, oh, if we make the quality of the supply good enough and distributed enough, the demand will naturally happen. but kind of what other ways and where can we find projects to actually like implement these in a way and begin to get like the other side flowing? Because without the demand, as you mentioned yourself, like none of this really matters.
It's dead in the water. Without the demand, it's dead in the
Yeah.
water. Yeah, you're right. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you if that was your.
Oh, no, I was like, so my question is, how can we actually work to increase the demand? Because a lot of what we've talked about so far in the past kind of half an hour have been very supply focused.
Okay, since we have very little time, I'm going to say 2 words: customer development. Startup businesses have to do customer development. They have to reach out and talk to their potential customers to find out what they would do, and not just get a like on Facebook. That's worth nothing. But to get something like a little skin in the game. And what that means is, like, are they willing to commit with, let's say an architecture firm is willing to commit a letter of intent to specify materials if they are provided in the manner that we are describing. That's a bit of skin in the game. They're putting their signature where their mouth is. Now, if somebody says, I'll put down money to actually pre-order on these materials, well, that's more. So it's the work that startups have to do there, Christian. We have to go, we don't get paid unless we find a customer, unless we find and serve that customer and satisfy that customer. So that's what we get to do. That's knowledge and experience that we have, that we bring to this, that we can say, we know what it takes to go out and get a customer. I've put hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of my life on the line for this. I know what it takes to get one. So that, that's why we go out and talk to these people. And if you get a bunch of no's, that's fine. At least, check that box, because you're only going to get a percentage. There are early adopters and there are laggards, and there's everything in between. So go find the people that are willing. They're the ones that are ravenously hungry for sustainability options that are out there today. Find them, get them to do a test, get them to sign a letter of intent, find a developer that has that intent. That sort of a thing. That's the work that we do, that says to the policymakers, please, please don't just put a policy in place and tell them they'll figure it out. They won't. What you need to do first is actually go and establish the links of that chain, what you're talking about. Get down to the end of that chain and find the demand. So that's my answer. Hope that helps.
Thank you. As we close, we're a bit over time. Once again, not a bad problem. We want to thank both Larry and Tina for coming on today and presenting. Very informative. As a note, this has been recorded and will go out. Larry and Tina, I will share your contact information if that's fine in the follow-up email to see if anyone wants to. And I've been taking some meeting minutes as well. Just quickly, and I promise to take 30 seconds. Tomorrow is the CLF All Hub meeting. That is at 9 a.m. If you do not have it on a calendar and want to be invited, please reach out to me. I can forward it through. And just a quick update for the reuse group going forward into this fall and winter. We want to focus more on collaborative efforts in solving problems within the industry. So think of it as little hackathons of really diving down onto problems like, what does it look like to design for disassembly with walls? What does it look like to enable some of these salvage pipelines and make some of these connections? So more to come as we go forward. But once again, thank you to our presenters, and for everyone else, thank you for attending today, and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Tina.